Welcome to the premiere Lion Lecture Series. It's not actually the premiere. I stole the name. We use that also for our books, the signature book talk title. I am very eloquent when I don't prepare. But for a while, I thought it would be really nice to have an event once a month where we bring together faculty, staff, students, members of the community. We're going to advertise a little better going forward, maybe, to give sort of TED-like talks. And we must always say TED-like because evidently if we say TED Talks, then they want to charge us money and give us cease and desist letters. And we can't afford to buy that title. So Lion Lecture Series it is. And so the idea will be we're going to meet on the fourth Thursday of the month here in the club so we can have an adult beverage. And I'm hoping that people will, talk to people you haven't talked before from other colleges. And we can learn about some fascinating ideas that our colleagues are doing. I've been telling the speakers you can talk about whatever you want as long as it's fascinating, right? So you don't have to talk about your research area. Me, myself, my research, it's not that great, but I can talk about the origin of the universe or exoplanets, right? So there's cool stuff, right? And so I'm hoping that this kind of takes off, and that we can maybe keep this going. And so, we may get Lucy back again talking about something else that's fascinating. It's a treasure trove. It's full of words, big words. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker tonight. So my thought is, we've had some little time to mingle, and then between the talks we'll have time to mingle, ask questions. It'd be great if we could have some dialogue afterwards, back and forth with the speaker. But a lot of how this goes depends on those of you that show up, and I hope that you continue to show up and participate and have fun, right? That's kind of the whole point. So, LucyPickering, she is from the UK. She is not from Australia. Do not make that mistake. And she got her PhD, and not from New Zealand. Poor New Zealand. PhD from University of Florida. She has been a few places, the University of Alabama, Georgetown, Georgia State. Those are different. And she's been here about 8 years. And let's see, 2 dogs, 2 cats, 1 horse, 1 husband, and 1 grandson. And that is the order that she listed them. Yes. Sorry. So, thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. I should explain that comment about Australia. It's because I come from the east end of London, which is the kind of sucky end, as opposed to the Princess Diana west end. So whenever I speak, people are like, "Are you from Australia?" And I'm like, I think that's because all the criminals came from the east end of London and got shipped out to Australia. So, yeah, just putting that out there as my linguistic theory. Thank you so much for coming. As Matt said, I'm Lucy Pickering. I am a professor of applied linguistics in literature and languages. And one thing, I watch some of these CSI, Criminal Minds, NCIS, and I see all this forensic stuff, and I'm like, really? Can they really do that? With a hair or a piece of blood or whatever. So one of the kinds of forensics that they use is linguistics. So that's what we're going to look at today. So forensic linguistics literally just means using language analysis or some kind of language support to solve or to understand crimes. Okay? So this, by the way, is your crack team of linguists at Tamworth. Let me just do that again. Oh, yeah. And we haven't actually solved any crimes yet, But we would like to take this opportunity to tell the police department at Temuk that we are ready and willing to do so, as you can see. So, in fact, there's a long history of forensic linguistics in America. And one of the first ones that comes to mind is the baby Lindbergh kidnapping. So Charles Lindbergh was a very famous aviator, and he did the first American aviator. He did the first transatlantic flight. And sadly, in 1932, his little baby was kidnapped out of his nursery. And next to the crib, the empty crib, they left a, is that not going to work? It's not going to work. They left a note saying the money that they wanted and also a warning not to call the police. And when the police experts looked at this, they said, you know, there were a couple of different pieces of this that made it look like it might be a first language speaker of German. I don't know if any of you speak German, but there's a gut and there's a couple of other things in there. So, in fact, when Richard Hauptmann, a first language speaker of German, was arrested for using some of the money from the kidnapping, this was used as part of the prosecution of him. Sadly, the baby died, and so he was prosecuted for kidnapping and murder, and this was part of the evidence that was used. Another super famous case, and I don't know if any of you are watching this new show called FBI Manhunt. Some of you might be, but this is a guy called Ted Kaczynski, who, FYI, was a math professor. So you got to watch those suckers. He mailed a number of explosive devices across the country. He killed a few people. He injured many, many more. He would make handmade bombs and actually send them out in the mail or drop them at people's offices. And this was one of the longest manhunts in American history to try and find this guy. After about 20 years, he wrote a manifesto, and it was published by the New York Times and by the Washington Post. And the reason that they published it was to see if anyone might recognize the style of the writing and the kinds of things he was saying. Well, this guy, Ted Kaczynski, was obsessed with the fact that we were becoming obsessed with technology and moving away from nature. And in fact, interestingly, as soon as it was published, his brother and sister-in-law immediately recognized this kind of language. And he was arrested and convicted. I mean, they found lots of other things too, like pipe bombs and things, which was good. But they also used this, evidence against him. But of course, in addition to writing, there's also speaking when it comes to language. And some of you who are my kind of age may remember Diana Gate or Squidgy Gate. I don't know if you remember this, but of course we all know Princess Diana. And at this time in 1992 was what we called the War of the Waleses, which was the war, the kind of publicity war between Princess Diana and Prince Charles just before they split up. So there was lots of stuff going backwards and forwards in newspapers and all kinds of things to try and decide who we were going to support. Well, in the middle of all this, the National Enquirer in the US and The Sun in the UK which, by the way, are about equivalent in terms of intellectual capacity, started publishing these transcripts, these squidgy transcripts, between Diana's purported lover, James Gilby, and Diana. And so you can see what's typically on a squidgy transcript. Gilby calls her Squidgy. I miss you, Squidgy. So do I. Diana says, I know I was very bad at lunch. I nearly started blubbing, which is crying. I'm not sure if that's American or British. Bloody hell, after all I've done for this effing family, which of course is the royal family. So this was, great stuff. And this was sent out by the Sunday Times, which is an intellectual publication in the UK, because they thought that even though the National Enquirer was saying that this was recorded over a publicly available scanner, so some lucky person had just been kind of scanning through the frequencies and managed, lo and behold, to and Princess Diana talking, right? They said they thought this was highly unlikely, and in fact this was probably a bugged landline by MI5, and this was part of this thing to discredit Lady Diana during this Wars of the Wowsers. So they sent this out to a number of labs, including the lab I worked at in the University of Florida as a graduate student. We were a forensics lab. So that's how come I knew about this. And we had to try and decide if we thought it was a bugged landline or a publicly available scanner. And sadly, you're gonna end up hearing about all of this, mostly with forensic phonetics. It's impossible to get enough evidence to tell. And essentially all the labs that it was sent to in the UK and the US said exactly the same thing, which was, there's something weird on the tape. It could be that it was recorded as a bugged landline, and then somebody kind of remixed it to make it sound like a scanned line, but we can't tell. There isn't enough evidence. And this is something that comes back again and again. Voice prints. I'm sure some of you have heard about voice prints on NCIS or CIS. So voice prints are supposed to be similar to fingerprints, right? They're supposed to go for the unique quality of the voice, right? Well, all I can say is that God help you if someone comes after you with a voice print. The error rate, researched error rate, is anywhere between 35 and 50%. So it could be me, or it could be that chick over there. Who knows, right? So voice print analysis is absolutely dreadful. And part of the problem is that it's almost impossible to recognize unique characteristics of voice that is in a different context and a different emotional state. We simply don't have those. If you know who's speaking, it's much easier to say. Like if we knew Diana was speaking, we could tell that. But if you don't know who's speaking, it's really difficult. So this came up just recently in a recent case in America, the Trayvon Martin shooting in 2012. Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman in Florida, and part of the evidence was a neighbor's 911 call. And part of that 911 call, you can hear somebody yelling in the background. And George Zimmerman said it was him yelling because Trayvon Martin was beating him up. Trayvon Martin's family said it was George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin said it was Trayvon Martin screaming for help. So unfortunately, as I say, it's so difficult to tell without context and different emotional state that essentially the FBI lab in Quantico said that they really couldn't tell. So something that went from an absolutely critical piece of evidence ended up being dropped by both sides because of these problems with voice print phonetic analysis. So the last thing we're going to look at is the combination, which is transcripts, which is written transcripts of speech. So I don't know how many of you remember the Yanny Laurel thing on your social media. Do you hear Yanny or do you hear Laurel? The most recent versions of these are the two that you see here, which is the McDonald's Happy Meal cussing minion, who, if you play him, if you got him he was one of the minions that you could get in a Happy Meal. And if you play him, it sounds like he's saying, "I'll be damned," and F that. So the most recent one that came through on my social media was Groover from Sesame Street. And there's a little clip of Sesame Street, and it sounds like Groover is dropping the F-bomb right in the middle of Sesame Street. It feels wrong to play that, so I'm going to let you go listen to that. You can pick that up. I'm not. I think it's wrong, Matt, to do Grover saying that on the... So, but I'm going to give you another example, which is slightly more serious. So this issue of what you hear versus what you think you hear is something in the legal context with phonetic forensics called priming. So basically, if someone tells you what you're hearing, you're more likely to think that you're hearing that, okay? So if there's a problem with the transcript, then potentially there's a problem with the evidence, right? So what I'm going to show you now to finish up here is a 90-second clip from my friend in Australia, a colleague of mine called Dr. Helen Fraser, who is a forensic phonetician, and who testified in the court case that this was used in. So I'm not going to give you any more background, but I'm going to let you watch this 90-second clip. So obviously that's Australia, but we have the exact same issue in the US. We do the exact same thing. We leave it up to juries and so on to do this. So as I say here, many thanks for your attention, particularly if you're going to be on jury duty anytime soon. I want to acknowledge our crack linguistics team and also Dr. Helen Fraser, whose work you just saw. Thanks very much.
All right. So do we have any questions?
One, two, yeah. Okay, so that trial, and you can look it up on Google, that was the Bain trial in New Zealand, because obviously she's Australian. And that was in the 1990s. And what happened was he was a young man. He came back to his house after his newspaper round, and he found his entire family dead. Literally, the entire family. So 2 siblings, mom, dad. 2 siblings and mom were in their rooms. Dad was in a separate spot. And so what they did was arrest him for killing his whole family. But what he said and what his lawyers said was that the father was, a abuser and whatever, and he had in fact committed a murder-suicide. So he had killed his wife and the other 2 children and then killed himself in a separate room. So now you see the relevance of I shot the prick, right? Because either it's him saying I shot dad, because he shot everybody else, or I shot everybody because he's a prick or whatever, or him coming home to this devastating murder scene and saying, I'm beside myself. I can't. So the original evidence, I shot the prick, was used, but it was overturned in an appeal. And due to various other things that were also overturned, that guy was actually released. Yeah. Yes, he called the police. That was a transcript from the police. Yeah. Well, I think they call it emotional utterances or agitated utterances or whatever, but, but the truth is there is no one, Helen's point is that the police could do that. They could do that, they could present that transcript, and if your defending attorney isn't smart enough, to use phonetic science or to get another expert, you're kind of screwed. So as with many things with the law, the technology has gone beyond the law. Yeah. 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 That's exactly right.
So in this case, this isn't a voice print per se, but
Right.
what confidence level is there in saying this is the transcript of the voice?
Well, right. So what Helen Fraser's work suggests, and I encourage you, if you're at all interested in this, to go to Helen Fraser's site, which is, she's really a pioneer in forensic phonetics. And you can find a lot more about her work at that site. And she's the only one of very, very few people who've done empirical studies of how reliable it is, and it's dreadful. It's a crapshoot. Some people, if you prime them with I shot the prick, they say, oh yes, I shot the prick. If you prime them with I can't breathe, they say, oh yeah, no way, it must be that. If you don't prime them with anything, they can't understand a thing. So what it comes down to is what's allowed in the court of law. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, dude, if you're ever up against a voice print analysis, you find yourself someone real fast because unfortunately, because of things like CIS and criminal minds and stuff, we think this is all like, totally kosher, and it's totally rubbish. Yeah, right. Which isn't good. Yeah. No, and that's the trouble. Of course, the quality, and this is the trouble with the quality of almost every covert recording, because they're not deliberate recordings. So this was exactly the problem with Trayvon Martin's. It didn't matter if you slowed it down, if you know, as soon as you start editing it, you degrade the quality of the voice, you know, all these things. This is why a voice print is nothing like a fingerprint. It's not even remotely close to a fingerprint. So, but you're right in the sense that people do, you know, people will have experts that stand up there and say, you know, well, I slowed it down and I did this. And in this case, they sent it to the FBI lab, and it was the FBI lab that said, you know, we really can't. So neither side used it. It started out as a super important piece of evidence, and then in the end, it just got, you know, dropped. Yeah.
So one thing I do find kind of fascinating, and I've used this in a physics of music class, if you take people that are well recorded, not a lot of noise.
Yeah.
So if you take John F. Kennedy
Yep.
and you reverse it, right? So you play it backwards and you say, who is this? They can identify it.
Yeah.
And Ronald Reagan and people that they've heard a lot.
Right.
Because the Fourier transforms and all that stuff.
Yeah, and so, you know, I mean, you're not going to confuse me with someone who's, you know, American, probably, right? Because the quality of our voices is such that you can pick out particular vowels and pick out particular consonants and get that right. But if it's, you know, if it's about me and that other British chick that's next to me, you know, it's like, okay, well, it might be her, but it might be her, you know. So it's pretty awful.